In this episode of the Christian Philosopher, we're going to talk about a defense of theology and how reason leads to faith. What's up, everyone? Scott Sullivan here from the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. We're talking about how reason leads to faith and how that path is intellectually sound. That is to say, we can move from reason and in accord with reason and work our way to the faith, which opens the doors to all the various branches of theology. All right, so how does this work? Well, we start with our sense knowledge. Of course, everybody agrees we can know the world through our sense experience, like our eyes and our ears. And our knowledge starts with that. That's how we begin to, learn things about the world. But it doesn't stop there. If it stopped there, it wouldn't do justice to all the things we know. For example, like, knowledge by memory, moral knowledge, but also intellectual knowledge. So what do we mean here? Well, as St. Thomas Aquinas argued, in addition to sense experience, our minds are able to know the natures of things. That is to say, when we come to see something, our minds have the ability to intellectually set aside all of the individual particular aspects of that thing and know the common nature of it. So let me give you an example. So take triangles, for example, okay? So we can learn about triangles. Oh, this one here is yellow, and this one here is made of wood, and we can kind of build our knowledge that way. But the mind is able to set aside all of the individual characteristics of that triangle. Okay, we don't have to think about triangle as made out of wood. It could be made out of anything. We don't have to think of it as yellow. It could be other things, you see. So the mind can set aside all the individual characteristics that we sense in the world with triangles and come to know the common nature of a triangle that would apply to all triangles. Doesn't matter what they're made out of or where they are, past, present, future, possible, actual. Our knowledge of the nature of triangles is applicable to all things. And if you couldn't do that, you wouldn't be able to do things like geometry. And in the same way, you wouldn't be able to know much at all if our minds weren't able to have this sort of intellectual knowledge. Even science, because the whole enterprise of science is based upon knowing the natures of things, whether we're talking about plants, frogs, whatever. And since our minds are able to know the natures of things, we're also even able to know the nature of being itself. This is how the whole philosophical enterprise of metaphysics gets started. So our minds are able to know the principles and the nature of being itself. And when you can do that, you can know something about all beings. So take, for example, say the principle of non-contradiction that everybody pretty much agrees with, right? A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same way. So think about that principle for a second. A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same way. Our whole reasoning process is based upon knowing this principle, and that is a principle of being. It applies to everything. God can't both exist and not exist at the same time, right? An angel can't both exist and not exist at the same time. It applies to physical things. It applies to all beings whatsoever. So this is an example of knowing a principle of being. And we can know other metaphysical principles as well. For example, every being is itself. That's the principle of identity. Or take, for example, the principle of causality, right? Whatever begins to exist, doesn't matter what it is, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Or take the principle of sufficient reason, for example. Every being has a reason for its existence, either in itself or in another. So these are all metaphysical principles of being, and as I said, they apply to all things whatsoever. And what we can do with these things, and we can't know a whole lot of them, but we can know enough to begin to formulate arguments. We can take things like the principle of sufficient reason, the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of causality, and we can take these principles and begin to formulate arguments for God's existence. We can formulate arguments for God's existence like the first cause argument, where we can reason that there has to be a first cause of all things. So now this gives us a natural knowledge of God, not a knowledge based on faith, a natural knowledge of God based on human reason. So by taking these principles that we know, we can put them into arguments and come to know the existence of God. So we can see here how human reason, how these can move from sense experience to intellectual knowledge to knowledge of God, knowledge of the supernatural. So knowing, the human ability to know these principles of being, is the intellectual bridge from the knowledge of natural things to the knowledge of supernatural things. So the point is that our minds can know by their own natural power that God exists. And then we can begin to ask questions, right? We can begin to wonder, hey, well, if there's this God out here that made us, wouldn't he might want to tell us more about himself? Wouldn't he might want to reveal more about, where we came from and what our purpose in life is and things like this? So then we look out into the world and we see, hey, do we find any such special revelation in the world? We can look at history and we see the teachings of Jesus Christ. And here we have a guy who claims to be God. That's a pretty bold claim, and he doesn't seem like he's lying. He doesn't seem like he's crazy. He's pretty much accepted by most people in the world as being very wise. And not only does he make these bold claims about being God, but he backs these claims up by fulfilling prophecy and doing miracles. So, a lot of people around him start to wonder. And then he performs his ultimate miracle that I think we can know through history, his resurrection from the dead. We can also see in history the rapid spread of his religion. In spite of all the powerful attempts by government to stomp it out, we see what his ideas have done for the world, like, for example, the abolition of slavery, raising the status of the family, human rights, and things like this. And we can see that Christ had God's message itself. Then when we compare Christianity with other religions, we can see that only Christianity has any comparable sort of intellectual merit or evidence or claims upon us. So now we can come to know that Christ is in fact God. He seems to be this divine ambassador that preaches a doctrine of salvation that's applicable to all men, and we have good reasons for thinking that is true. And so next we come to the study of the church, the ecclesia. It's reasonable to think that if Christ did have this doctrine of salvation that's very important and applicable to all men, that he would want to entrust it to a living teacher, a living magisterium. And we can see that in history and in Scripture, that is in fact true. Christ as God did in fact establish a church. But if the church is the living teacher of Christ's doctrine, we might ask, okay, well, where does the church get this doctrine? Where does the church get Christ's doctrine? And this leads to the study of the fonts of revelation, the sources of revelation, or de fontibus revelationis, where we find that these sources are Scripture and tradition. So what are we supposed to do with this message of Christ? Not just the doctrines revealed by Christ, but also the dogmas defined by his church. The answer is faith. Faith is the act by which I accept that revelation. Let me say that again. Faith is the mental act by which I accept that revelation. This is a really important point because this is where we transition from reason to faith. We transition from the arguments of apologetica, to the study of the faith, de fide. So we have two kind of important transition points in this little intellectual journey here. The first one was from when we had just reason by itself, without faith, just the mind alone was able to transfer from natural knowledge to supernatural knowledge when we come to know the existence of God through the powers of our own natural reason. And then at this point now, where we know Christ and his revelation, the mind can transition from reason to faith. So reason leads us to faith. Reason leads us to the act of accepting Christ's revelation. And then that act of faith then opens the door to all the areas of theology. So now we can look at what Revelation says about God's nature and existence and all those divine attributes that we also found in our philosophical knowledge of God. We can look at the study of the Trinity, De Trinitate. It follows also from knowing God's revelation and studying the internal operations of God. We can look at God's external works, opera Dei ad extra, and we can come to know how God created. He made creation and then elevated man to a supernatural state. This leads us to the study of Christ as Redeemer, Christ as the incarnate Word, Christology, and things like this. We can see that these fruits of the redemptions are graces, and we can come to study the area of theology known as de gratia, or the study of grace. We can ask about how grace is given to us, and this leads us to the theological study of the sacraments, de sacramentis. And next in theology, we can study the working of grace in our soul and what results from that, which leads to the study of eschatology, the study of the four last things: death, judgment, heaven and hell. We can study de caelo, heaven, where man receives grace. Purgatory, de purgatatio, where man partly refuses grace. And finally, hell, de inferno, where man loses grace completely. All right, so that's basically it in a nutshell. The human mind can rationally proceed from reason to faith. We start with sense experience. We can move to intellectual knowledge and know God and things like that, which causes us to see Christ and his workings in history, where we make an act of faith, and that opens the door to all the areas of dogmatic theology. Hey guys, just real quickly here, if you like these videos and you want to learn more about some of the stuff that I teach, you can visit my website, scottmsullivan.com. I have what I call the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. We have courses in logic, philosophy, theology, a whole bunch of stuff. You can check it out. We have a free trial. It's available on my website. Again, check it out, scottmsullivan.com.